Okay, so we start this class in Chapter 1. And in Chapter 1, we're going to walk through the main question, which is, what is psychology? Now, the really awesome and cool thing about psychology is that it's not just one thing. You might have this impression of psychology from watching movies, or having family members, or friends that are counselors. You might have this idea that psychology is just being a therapist. And hey, being a therapist is totally awesome. And a large majority of psychologists are in that subfield of psychology. But psychology is more than just one particular task or professional role. It covers a wide range of fields and subfields into the investigation of why we do what we do. So my hope for you during class is that you take your life and your career aspirations and your talents and your strengths and your weaknesses, and you apply it to the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. There is not a single career or artistic choice or creative pursuit that can't benefit from understanding humanity a little bit more. We want to ask these big questions. Why do people do what they do? How can we help human behavior and mental processes? What's the influence of culture, subculture, context, situation, personality? What are things that go right with us in our human behavior and mental processes? Stuff like compassion and altruism and helping and nurture. And what are some of the things that are not right and don't go right? And how can we help them? How can we intervene with them? How can we make our world better? This class is going to walk through many different lenses by which we look at that question. So whether we're talking about individual neurons in your brain, or we're talking about huge groups and cultures of people, all of that investigation is going to be covered underneath the umbrella of psychology, the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. So let's get started. All right, well, in any class, we start in Chapter 1. And Chapter 1 is a really good place for us to get some common terminology and definitions of what we're talking about and what we will talk about. So in Chapter 1, we're going to review some of the basic definitions of what psychology is, so you have an apprehension of what to look forward to this semester. And I want to challenge you throughout this semester. Psychology is much larger than one semester can even cover. We're going to cover as much as we can in the major perspectives in psychology. So I want to encourage you to stay engaged. Every chapter is going to have a little piece of the puzzle, and the picture and the puzzle is much larger than just even this one class can cover. So it's going to be your job in each chapter to find something relevant, not just viewing it as, oh, I have to learn this for this class, but trying to take it home to your heart, your career, your strength, your weaknesses, and apply it, because these insights are potentially quite useful to you in other domains of your life. So in this chapter, we're going to cover main definitions within psychology. In doing so, we're going to have to review the main approaches and perspectives within psychology. To do so, we have to talk about psychology's history, where it's been, where it has been, and where it's going. Chapter 1 also gives you a broad outline of some of the careers within psychology. As I've mentioned, psychology is so much broader than just one thing. And so you'll see at the end of this chapter that psychology encompasses a wide variety of career options and intellectual academic pursuits. Often students take their first psychology course because they're interested in helping others, and they want to learn more about themselves and why they do what they do. Sometimes students take a psychology course because it either satisfies a general education requirement, or it's required for a program of study such as nursing or pre-med. No matter whether you're a psychology major or a biology major, this class has things that are going to be useful to you. And I'm so delighted to be the one that shares this information with you. An education in psychology is valuable for a number of reasons. Psychology students hone critical thinking skills and are trained in the use of the scientific method, which we're going to be talking about in this lecture, but also Chapter 2 as well. Critical thinking is the active application of a set of skills to information for the understanding and the evaluation of that information. The evaluation of information is such an important skill, especially in a world that has many competing facts and pieces, many of which are designed to either be misleading or to be persuasive in some way. So critical thinking really involves maintaining an attitude of openness and even skepticism, recognizing internal biases, making use of your logical thinking skills, asking good questions, and making good quality, unbiased observations. And this is why I love psychology. We want to understand the truth. We don't want to walk into a situation and understand ourselves with bias. We want to see things as they actually are. And that requires critical thinking. It requires an open mind, and it requires the scientific method. Together, those critical thinking skills absolutely are meant to increase your scientific literacy and to prepare you to critically evaluate various forms of information that you receive throughout your college career, in your personal life, and beyond. In addition to these really good skills, psychology students should come out of a Psych 101 class longing to understand the complex factors that shape their own behavior. I hope that you end up appreciating the interaction of your biology, your environment, your experiences, your thoughts, your feelings, your actions in determining who you are and how you behave. I hope that you come to appreciate the tremendous diversity, strengths, and weaknesses of being a human. And I have to tell you that no matter what season of my life it's been, there has never been a season in my life, personal, professional, or otherwise, in which understanding myself and others better hasn't led to better outcomes. So no matter what your major is, no matter what your career goal is, and no matter what has you in this class in this particular semester, I hope with all of my heart that you can hear that I want you to walk out of it knowing more and having a broader appreciation for what makes you you. Okay, before we dive into course content, I want to address some presumptions and preconceptions of what a psychologist does or is. How many of you have had an acquaintance who is a psychologist? How many of you have interacted with a psychologist? Even if you do not personally know a psychologist, you certainly have an idea, perhaps, of what a psychologist is and what they do. Now, outside of personal experience or engagement, maybe you had a school psychologist that helped you career plan in high school. Maybe you have a family member that's a counselor. Maybe your mom or dad are actually a psychologist and they have clients. Or maybe you've interacted with a college professor who's a psychologist. So I'm a psychologist and I work in two different areas. I work as a college professor and also as a social worker with foster kids and kids that are up for adoption. So maybe you've had some real life experiences with people with the title psychologist. Even if you haven't, I guarantee you that you've watched a television program, something on Netflix, you've read a book or saw a movie, and there has been a psychologist in that movie. Can you think of some psychologists from popular movies? And a follow-up question, what type of psychologist do you often see in media representations of psychology? Well, since psychology is the scientific study of why people do what they do, many times when we think of psychology, we think of therapists, we think of clinical psychologists, we think of people working with populations, clinical populations, or maybe forensic populations within the legal system. And so quite often psychology gets narrowly applied to just the clinical act of addressing or diagnosing things that are going wrong within a person. But I want to keep your mind open here, that question of why do people do what they do It applies to things outside of clinical realms too. So whether you're a high school principal or a social worker or a sports physical therapist or a researcher in the biology department or a biochemist or a psychiatrist or a doctor or a teacher, knowing why people do what they do has implications for many fields. So part of your job in this class is to think about how much knowing how people behave and why they behave that way, how frequently it's useful in a variety of contexts. Now, we addressed media conceptions first because we want to dispel and or clarify exactly the definition of psychology. In literature and media representations, and maybe even just in common understanding, psychologists are often seen as counselors or therapists, and they are, but they're also part of a much bigger scientific picture. So psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And a key term here, you guys, has to do with scientific. Other domains and other fields in the humanities, for example, might also study human behavior and mental processes. Sociology, history, creative writing, and even philosophy. These other fields absolutely want to understand why people do what they do. The differentiating factor, however, is that psychology wants to employ and use the scientific method to study that foundational human nature question. And what do we mean by scientific? Well, by scientific, we're meaning that there are systematic, objective methods in the description, explanation, prediction, and intervention of answering these big questions about human nature. To apply the scientific method, a researcher with a question about how or why something happens is going to propose a tentative explanation. We're going to call that a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is meant to explain a phenomenon. And it's not just an explanation. It should fit into the context of what we already know about the world through scientific theory and study. So scientific theory is a broad explanation or a group of explanations for some aspect of the natural world that is consistently supported by empirical evidence over time. A theory is the best understanding that we have of that part of the natural world at the time that we are studying it. So, with a hypothesis and an overarching theory, the researcher then can make observations, or better still, carry out an experiment to test the validity of what they think about the world. That test and its results are then published and shared in the scientific community so that we can validate and replicate and continue to hone our understanding of human nature. Within the scientific method, we're looking for testable questions. We're not really looking for opinions or editorializing on the world. We're actually looking for phenomenon that can be observed, tested, and studied in a way that's perceivable and measurable. You're going to see throughout class that I refer to this process of what we do as empirical, or we have empirically based observations. An empirical method for acquiring knowledge about human nature is based on observation and scientific experimentation. That is objective, systematic experimentation. Rather than just subjective feelings, discussions, arguments. You know, if you're in a philosophy department, you're going to have like this Socratic method of going back and forth and dialoguing on an issue. That's not to say that there aren't discussions within psychology, but what keeps psychology as foundationally different from philosophy is that psychology will want to employ the empirical method to answer those questions. It's not until the late 1800s that psychology becomes accepted as its own academic discipline. Before this time, the workings of the mind were considered under the auspices of philosophy. But psychology also has influences historically in the biological sciences as well. So we see that philosophy and biology have asked some big questions of why people do what they do. So think of it this way. Philosophy asks a big question of who are we? What are we doing? Biology asks a very specific question about individual cells and individual cause-effect relationships of the physical world on human behavior and mental processes. Psychology is going to acknowledge both the very small, this is like neurons and cells in your body, parts of your brain, and also the very large, like culture, subculture, society, generation. And all the while, between very small and very large, systematically, objectively, and without bias, try to understand why people do what they do. Therefore, psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. For our purposes here, we're going to see behavior as human action that can be directly observed, and mental processes we're going to see as thoughts, feelings, and internal motives. So all in all, psychology is going to try to, as objectively and reliably and truthfully as possible, assess the nature of who you are and how you act, and also who you are in some of the ways that other people can't see, like your feelings, thoughts, and internal motivations. So hopefully by this point, I've convinced you that psychology is uniquely located between very, very big questions and very, very small, precise questions. In the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes, we're going to value the empirical method. And as I've mentioned, the empirical method is going to involve us observing an event or observing human behavior, collecting data on that event or phenomenon or behavior, and coming to logical conclusions about how that behavior has taken place. We're not going to do that by ourselves either. One study is not going to explain an issue for all time. We're going to take our empirical method and take our observations and take our data analysis and place it into the field's hands, where over time other people are going to do similar studies or studies that add to our understanding or edit our understanding of human nature, and we're going to do that together. So, in doing the science of psychology, there are some things that are going to be important for us as skills in employing the empirical method. And these skills are critical thinking, skepticism, objectivity, and curiosity. Many of these muscles, I think, are formed intellectually over time, as we're exposed to a variety of perspectives and information pieces. You're in college, you totally understand that you have so many things coming at you at the same time. If you're taking this class for a general education unit, you might have calculus and OChem and sociology and a dance class all at the same time as this class. Wow, that's a lot of different strengths, weaknesses, and approaches, right? So therefore, these muscles of critical thinking and unbiased thinking, they develop over time as you're exposed to a diverse amount of information. Well, one of the very interesting and complicated and beautiful and frustrating aspects of human nature is that a lot of times people see what they want to see. We call this confirmation bias. But you know why I love psychology? Psychology challenges that subjectivity. So as you move through this class, I want you to think about how wonderful and complex and difficult and beautiful and frustrating studying human nature can be. And we're trying to study it objectively, with critical thinking, with open-mindedness, creativity, curiosity, and accuracy. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of psychology. Psychology has its roots within philosophy. Now, this philosophy question, what is the nature of being? Who are we? Why are we here? These are big questions, and these questions are by no means brand new to us. In the 4th and 5th centuries, you have philosophers from ancient Greece like Socrates and Aristotle asking these big questions. You'll hear of the Socratic method, or the method of going back and forth trying to understand an issue. We owe a lot in psychology to the Western philosophies and the ancient Greeks of asking big questions about who we are and why we're here. Many of these philosophers are going to debate the nature between mind and action, between the inside parts of who you are, the unobservable places, thoughts, feelings, and motives, and the observable human behaviors and actions. What's the connection between how you think and how you behave? A lot of this has to do in philosophy with this idea of the mind. What is the mind? Much later, you'll see another philosopher by the name of Descartes, René Descartes. And he has this big saying that you've probably heard before: I think, therefore I am. So what should you understand about philosophy? Well, you should understand that for centuries, people have been trying to understand the connections or disconnections between mind, body, soul, spirit, and psyche. We get the name psychology from this term, this Greek term from Greek mythology of psyche, meaning soul. Psychology also has a foundation and a history within the biological or the physiological sciences. So you have the philosophers asking big questions about existence and being and mind and identity and soul. And then you have the biologists asking questions about how the body functions and what the physiology, the specific physiology of a human is. So as these big and small questions advance, we see the foundations building for what's going to become the academic discipline of psychology. Psychology is a relatively young science, with its experimental roots being placed in the 19th century. Two researchers working in the 19th century are generally credited as being the founders of psychology as a science and an academic discipline that was distinct from philosophy or physiology. So let's talk a little bit about the founding father of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt was a German scientist who was the first person to be referred to as a psychologist. His famous book entitled Principles of Physiological Psychology was published in 1873. Wundt viewed psychology as a scientific study of conscious experience. And he believed that the goal of psychology was to identify components of consciousness and how those components combined to result in our conscious experience. Wundt used something called introspection. He called it internal perception, a process by which someone examines their own conscious experience as objectively as possible, making the mind like any other aspect of nature that a scientist could observe. Wundt's version of introspection used only very specific experimental conditions in which an external stimulus was designed to produce a scientifically observable or repeatable experience of the mind. How he did this is he systematically brought people into a lab and trained them on the use of introspection. So he might place an apple in their hand and have them introspect about the experience. The apple is round, it is red, it smells good, it has a leaf, it is a certain weight. And so there, in that introspective process, he is training people to have a systematic, observable, objective, repeatable, detailed self-report of their conscious experiences. So this attempt to understand the structure or characteristics of the conscious mind or the conscious experience, it's known as structuralism. And Wundt established the first psychology laboratory in a German university in 1879. In this laboratory, Wundt and his students conducted experiments on, for example, reaction times. A participant would sometimes be in a room isolated from the scientist, and that person would receive a stimulus such as a light or an image or a sound. The participant's reaction to the stimulus would be to push a button, and then an apparatus would record how quickly that reaction time was. Wundt could measure reaction time up to 1/1000th of a second. And in that reaction time experiment, you guys, we are seeing one of the very first applications of the scientific process being applied to human behavior and mental processes. Not just philosophical discussions, not just back and forth dialogues about what we think could happen, but actual, measurable, systematic, objective experimentation. So since Wundt was interested in thought life and the mind, and he's interested in consciousness, this structuralism, or the investigation into the structures of the mind, is really the beginning of our study of mental processes. And so his attempt to study the human mind by way of introspection, conscious reflection, current evaluation, current perception, it's foundational to psychology. However, despite his best efforts to train individuals in the process of introspection, this process remained highly subjective, and there was very little agreement between individuals. As a result, the structuralist approach, although foundational and although important by nature of being the first place for us to have the empirical method in psychology and the attempt at the empirical method, that this approach, structuralism, doesn't quite capture everything we need it to capture in regard to understanding human behavior. So here comes along another researcher by the name of William James. William James is credited for essentially starting psychology in America. He's the first American psychologist who espoused a different perspective on how psychology should operate. James was introduced to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and he thought that it was a good explanation of an organism's characteristics and behaviors. Key to that evolutionary theory is the idea that natural selection leads to organisms that are adapted to their environment, including their behavior. Adaptation means that a trait of an organism has a function for the survival and reproduction of the individual. As James saw it, psychology's purpose was to study the function of behavior in the world, and as such, his perspective is known as functionalism. Functionalism focused on how mental activities helped an organism fit into its environment. Functionalism also has a second, more subtle meaning in that the functionalists were more interested in the operation of the whole mind, rather than its just individual structures or parts, which were the focus of structuralism. Like Wundt, James believed that introspection could serve as one means by which someone might study mental activities. Now, to James, the function or purpose of those actions and thoughts, that's what's really important. So let's talk a little bit about introspection in James's perspective. If you've ever heard of something called stream of consciousness, this is James's idea. This is the idea that as you're introspecting about something that has already happened, you have already changed how you're thinking about what you were thinking about as you are thinking about what you're currently thinking about. It's changing your stream of consciousness. It's constantly moving. Your perception, your mind, is constantly in a stream of current nows. And so as you go back to introspect on something in the past, your mind has already changed because of your present. That's a really big, hard to understand thing, right? So in trying to understand the human mind, a huge topic, right? Oh my gosh, human mind. What James narrows down his focus on, therefore, is what is the purpose and what is the function of how we are thinking. Wundt and James together are founding fathers of psychology. And you'll see that some of James's ideas and his approach, or the functionalist approach, can be applied in different subfields, for example, educational psychology, even today. Now, occurring around the same time, and we put this together because science advances not just academic field by academic field. Science as a whole, if something good happens in biology, this can have really great impact in other fields, right? Because science is one really big tapestry, one very big quilt of trying to understand the natural world. So at the same time as Wundt is in Germany and James is in America, we have the theory of evolution being proposed by Charles Darwin. And you might ask yourself a question like, well, we're talking about psychology, why are we talking about biology? Now, the connection point is that the theory of evolution has an influence on James in such a way as it gets James asking questions about what the function or what the adaptive nature of the mind is. What is the purpose or function? That question, what is the function or purpose of behavior, is also a question that Darwin was asking as he looks at environment and genes and adaptability and goodness of fit and survival and comes up with the idea of natural selection. So that concept of natural selection has a great influence on James, as James wants to think about the adaptive nature of human characteristics and their influences on behavior and mental processes. So this perspective, the perspective that environments have an influence on an organism, that's also a really big concept that we carry into our understanding of how an individual acts within a group. So what you'll see is that even Darwin's idea allows us to have a broader understanding or ask the question, how do people fit within the context or situation or environment that they're in? That question of how a person behaves within their environment is crucial to an aspect of psychology and a field of psychology called social psychology that we're going to discuss at the end of this class. So this idea of natural selection allows us to ask some questions about the connection between the organism and the environment that they're in. This idea has behaviors and human characteristics as being based in adaptability and function and survival. And this perspective also acknowledges the importance of the situation. Whether or not there's resources there, competitors, predators, stronger, weaker others, the situation matters. So when you think about how psychology begins, we're going to think about the very big stuff, philosophical, and also the somewhat smaller stuff, biological, all of which are asking the same question. Why do people do what they do? To Wundt, why people do what they do has to do with the structures of their mind. To James, why do people do what they do has to do with the function of the behavior, the purpose of the behavior. And to Darwin, why do people do what they do? They do that because it's adaptable and it's worked before and it's promoted survival and reproduction in the past. Given that we know a little bit about the history of psychology, let's now turn our focus to the contemporary approaches in psychology. So we're going to start with the most micro perspective, or the biological perspective. As the name suggests, biopsychology explores how our biology influences our behavior. While biological psychology is a broad field, many biological psychologists want to understand the structure and function of the nervous system as it's related to human behavior and mental processes. As such, they often will combine strategies of both psychology and physiology to accomplish this goal. The research interests of biological psychologists span a number of domains, including but not limited to sensory and motor systems, sleep, drug use, eating, reproducing, neurodevelopment, plasticity or the growth of the nervous system, and stuff like biological connections to psychological disorders. It will probably come as no surprise that individuals from all sorts of backgrounds are involved in this research, including biologists, medical professionals, physiologists, chemists, neurologists. This interdisciplinary approach is often referred to as neuroscience, of which biological psychology is a component. To a biological psychologist, the brain is the physical basis of all thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So therefore, it makes sense that a biological psychologist is going to study the brain and nervous system. So let's return back to that big question in psychology. Why do people do what they do? The biological approach is going to say that the brain, the actual physical structure of the brain, the neurons, the glial cells, the connections in the nervous system, that those things, including genetics and biochemistry and the cells within your person, that's why you do what you do. Early work in the field of behaviorism was conducted by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov studied a form of learning behavior called a conditioned reflex, in which an animal or human produced a reflex, which is an unconscious response to a stimulus. You've probably heard of Pavlov's dogs. So in his study, he was trying to study the salivation reflex and the salivation response of dogs. But something was screwing up the data in his experiment because the dogs were starting to drool before the food was presented. So he was really confused. He's like, well, gosh, the unlearned or unconscious response, the reflex, the salivation, why is it happening before the food is even present? Well, what he learned, of course, is that the dogs were smart. The dogs, they could hear that the experimenter was coming. And the sound of the experimenters approaching, the dogs were anticipating being fed. So they were drooling. They had learned or been conditioned to learn to drool to something that was not the original stimulus. So they're drooling not to the food being present, but to the sound that's going to be before the food is present. This is conditioning. And this is a classic behaviorism example. We call this form of learning classical conditioning. Another notable behaviorist is John B. Watson. Now, while Wundt and James were concerned with understanding conscious experience, Watson really rejected even the idea of studying consciousness. Watson thought that the study of consciousness was flawed. He actually believed that the objective analysis of the mind was impossible, so he preferred to focus on directly observable behavior and was trying to study how to adapt or intervene or teach that behavior to be something else. Watson was a major proponent of shifting the focus of psychology from the conscious experience or stream of consciousness over to observable behavior. And this approach of observing and controlling behavior came to be known as behaviorism. B.F. Skinner is also a really big name in behaviorism. Like Watson, Skinner was a behaviorist, and he concentrated on how behavior was affected by its consequences. Therefore, Skinner spoke about reinforcement and punishment as major factors in driving behavior and influencing behavior. Skinner's focus on positive and negative reinforcement of learned behaviors had a lasting influence in psychology. Overall, behaviorism dominated experimental psychology for several decades, and its influence can still be felt today. Behaviorism is largely responsible for establishing psychology as a scientific discipline through its objective methods, and especially through the experimental method. In addition, this behaviorist approach is often used in behavioral or cognitive behavioral therapy, behavior modification, in multiple settings like classrooms or clinics. And it's also led to a lot of research on environmental influences on human behavior. So the question, why do people do what they do, to a behaviorist, the answer has to do with rewards and punishments. That there's something in the environment that's being learned that is impacting the observed behavior of the organism. Perhaps one of the most influential and well-known figures in psychology's history is Sigmund Freud. Freud was an Austrian neurologist who was fascinated by his patients suffering from different hysteric symptoms and neurosis. Hysteria was an ancient diagnosis for disorders, primarily of women with a wide variety of symptoms, including physical symptoms and emotional problems, none of which had an apparent physical cause. Freud theorized that many of his patients' problems arose from the unconscious mind. In Freud's view, the unconscious mind was a repository of feelings and urges of which the person or client had no awareness. Gaining access to the unconscious, then, was crucial to the successful resolution of the patient's problems. According to Freud, the unconscious mind could be accessed through dream analysis, by examinations of the first words that come to mind, that's free association, or through things like innocent slips of the tongue. Psychoanalytic theory focuses on the role of a person's unconscious, and it also talks about how early childhood experiences can form later adult issues. This particular perspective, the psychoanalytic perspective, it absolutely dominates clinical psychology for decades. And we certainly can't understate how important some of these ideas are. And when we get a little bit farther in class, we're going to talk more specifically, about Freud's ideas. Freud's ideas were extremely influential. And many people, when they think of psychologists, they often think of Freud. He's had a lasting impact on our understanding of human nature. So in this psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approach, why do people do what they do? They do what they do because there's an unconscious part of who they are. There's part of their mind and drives that they don't have access to consciously. And those unconscious places are driven and dark and mysterious. And those unconscious places are influencing their current behavior. Another very different perspective in psychology, very different from the psychodynamic perspective, is the humanistic perspective. During the 20th century, American psychology was dominated by behaviorism and psychoanalysis. However, some psychologists were uncomfortable with what they viewed as limited perspectives being so influential in the field. They objected to the pessimism and determinism of Freud. They also disliked the reductionism or simplifying nature of behaviorism. Some psychologists began to form their own ideas that emphasized personal control, intention, and disposition for good as being important for our self-concept and action. Therefore, humanism emerged. Humanism is a perspective within psychology that emphasizes what goes right for human nature, or the things that are good. Two of the most well-known proponents of humanistic psychology are Maslow and Rogers. Both Maslow and Rogers are well-known names among students of psychology, and you're going to learn more about them in a later chapter, and their ideas have influenced many scholars. So why do people do what they do within the humanistic approach? They do what they do because there's an inner good drive, an innate drive towards personal control, self-actualization, and success. And those positive characteristics lead a person to make decisions about their behavior and mental processes. Okay, another large perspective in psychology is the cognitive approach. Now, the cognitive approach is very different from the behavioristic approach. Behaviorism's emphasis on objectivity and focus on external behavior pulled psychology's attention away from the mind for quite some time. But the early work of some of the humanistic psychologists started to redirect attention back to the individual human as a whole, and that includes consciousness and being self-aware. By the 1950s, new disciplinary perspectives in linguistics, neuroscience, and computer science were emerging, and these areas revived interest in the human mind as a focus of scientific investigation. This particular perspective has come to be known as the cognitive revolution. In the cognitive perspective, the mind is going to be seen like a computer. There is going to be a metaphor here of information processing. This means that a cognitive psychologist is going to be interested in learning how humans interpret and how they deal with incoming information into their system, how they process it, weigh it, and store it away, and how they apply it or respond to it. Input, storage, and output, essentially. So why do people do what they do? They do what they do because they are an information processing system that is complex, and they're taking complex inputs, processing them to produce behavioral outputs. Another perspective in psychology broadens us out even more. So we started, when we were talking about the perspectives, we started at the smallest unit. We started with biology, with the brain and the nervous system. And we get larger and larger in our level of analysis, essentially. Another approach in psychology would be the sociocultural approach. To a social psychologist or a cultural psychologist, or a psychologist that's dealing with group dynamics, cultures, subcultures, why do people do what they do? The answer is going to look a little bit into what the context is. People do what they do because they're part of certain environments that have different rules, regulations, and expectations. So a sociocultural psychologist is going to study different ethnicities, different cultural groups, different subcultural groups, different generations, within and across countries and cultures. And what we'll see is that if we're able to answer the question, why do people do what they do, and why they do what they do stays the same across cultures, wow, that's something pretty foundationally human. But if things look different across cultures in certain behaviors and mental processes, then we can say that the environment has had an impact on the psychology of the person. So I hope you can see that across these perspectives, it's very clear that psychology is not just therapy. It's not just clinical psychology. That is one of the fields of psychology. Psychology is not limited just to psychological disorders like depression and anxiety. It is much bigger than just the things that go wrong. It also talks about the things that go right. So you'll see that there's a field of psychology called positive psychology that is very, very humanistic in nature. It emphasizes human strengths and studies things like happiness and gratitude. At the end of your chapter, you're going to see a discussion of some of the subfields within psychology. And I strongly suggest that you look in those subfields and see if there's anything that you find interesting or that seems like something you'd be interested in pursuing. The clinical and counseling subfields within psychology are the most widely practiced specialties within psychology as a whole. But that doesn't mean that psychology isn't broad and amazingly open for different opportunities and experiences and things to study. Whether it's something very small like an individual cell in your brain, or it's very large like an entire culture, Psychology is the place to study those questions. And if you're somewhat unsure of what you want to do as a career or what you want to declare as a major, may I suggest that psychology is able to round out a wide variety of career opportunities and options. Having a basic understanding of human behavior and mental processes, it's going to benefit you. There are so many areas and subfields within psychology. As mentioned at the end of your chapter, you'll see that there's many different areas of specialization. So if you have a question about human nature, psychology wants to address it. Now, in this class, we're not going to be able to specialize and talk about each of these specialties. Actually, each of these specialties is its own class later on. So hey, if you're a psychology major, take a look at this list, you guys. You'll be able to take some of these classes and dive into them deeply later on. So in wrapping up chapter 1, you'll notice that in your textbook, at the end of every chapter, there's a section devoted to health and wellness. It's really cool because this is really sort of a personal way to apply the chapter to your own life. One of the big questions that's asked at the tail end of the chapter, something that I'm going to leave you with, is this discussion and development of trying to understand the connection between the mind and the body, how the mind impacts your body and how the body impacts your mind. How can your thinking impact your physical health? And how can your physical health impact your cognitive thinking? What we're going to find, of course, is that the relationships between mind and body, between thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and actions are complicated, complex, beautiful, and worthy of investigation. So I hope that you'll come with me as we investigate human behavior and mental processes. All right, you guys, I'm so proud of you. I hope that you enjoyed chapter 1. In the next chapter, we'll be talking about the scientific method. And also, homework number 1 will cover both chapters 1 and chapters 2. As always, I'm so honored and looking forward to being your professor this semester. I hope that you learn a lot about yourself and others in this class. And wherever this lecture finds you, I hope you're having a good week. Good job, you guys. I'll catch you next time.